to listen to. Okay, I'd like to welcome all of you to the Hueneme Museum, and I'd also like to pass this by everybody that and these are dates that are way in advance, but on August the 8th of 2020, we're going to be recognizing Julia Brownlee, Jackie Irwin, and Kelly Long. And it will either be in the front area of the City Hall or in the Carpenter Center. I got to call that shot based on what the weather's like at that time of the year.
Does people make any difference?
Are they Republicans?
Pardon me?
Irwin is a Democrat.
It's equal opportunity.
Yeah.
I got the cover. So the other thing is we're definitely going to be bringing the Vietnam movie wall to Hueneme in 2021, and it'll be held in, probably in parking lot A. They'll close that whole parking lot. We're going to have a flyover C-130s on Memorial Day, and on opening day we're going to have a flyover, which I'm working with two different people. We're probably going to have 2 to 3 Medal of Honor winners present. One of them is a graduate of Oxnard High School and received the Medal of Honor in Vietnam, and they named the Army Medical School after this fella, and he lives back east right now.
Are you talking about Al Sloan?
Yeah,
He's coming?
yeah. Well, we're working that out right now.
Oh,
Good luck. I
I
have
have
ways.
trouble getting a hold of us. I would love to come see him.
I've got the contacts.
Oh, good.
A couple directions. But, so that's just giving you a little bit of advance so you can see that we're moving right along. And today we're honored to have our friend Frank Barajas here, Oxnard native and professor of Chicana studies at Channel Islands University. And Frank honors us by his presence all the time because he's a great speaker. He's very informed, and you'll learn an awful lot. And I'll always go away with thinking I couldn't believe that the Oxnard school district got away with segregation so long. The South was integrated, and Oxnard was still segregated. So these guys are real creative out here in California. So I'll turn it over to Frank. Thank you again, Frank. Thank you for your time.
I'm all set, the light's on. Thank you, Larry, for that introduction. And also, I really appreciate being re-invited here. This is my third time for Hueneme Historical Society. Museum. Yeah. That's right. It's like Saturday Night Live, right? It's Saturday during the day. A beautiful day here in the seaside area. We consider Hueneme part of the Oxnard Plain still?
We consider Oxnard Plain part of the Hueneme Plain.
Okay.
When they hijacked it.
So the locals know these kind of a bit of rivalries, right, that go on. It's great to be here. So last time I spoke, it was on the segregation of schools in the Oxnard district, to the elementary schools. And it's part of a larger project that looks at the Chicana movement here in Ventura County, that involved largely, but not exclusively, Mexican American youth in Ventura County. And my angle in regards to what I'm going to be talking about today, but also in the book manuscript project, is the role of mentors. Right? Recently there was a discussion or a article in the New Yorker by Louis Mannon, historian, and he points out that the youth movement of the 1960s was largely a movement led by non-baby boomers. often people think the baby boomers of the 1946 to about 1970 pushed the movement forward. But it was actually those that were born before the baby boom generation that were up front. And it makes sense if you think about people like Cesar Chavez, who was not a baby boomer, right? Martin Luther King was not a baby boomer, right? Or he points to people in terms of like music. Also, one of them, Jimi Hendrix, was not of the baby boom generation, right? And there were others that he points to. So, in that spirit, it sort of echoed what I was working on, what I've been working on since 2010, when I was finishing up my first book. And I didn't want it to be my only book, so I still got some life in me. And well, I'm going to try something else, right? And it was Curious Unions, which I looked largely at Oxnard in terms of the Mexican Americans. They identify themselves as Mexican Americans. And I'm going to talk a bit about that. That's part of my story. And I saw there was in my research, looking at the newspapers of the Oxnard Press Courier, the Ventura County Star Free Press, using also the Los Angeles Times and other newspapers, in addition to archival collections in Detroit at the Walter Reuther Library, the Southern California Library in Los Angeles, UCLA Library, that the story did not end in 1961. There was a continuous movement taking place after Cesar Chavez left Oxnard and Ventura County to organize what is known as the Community Service Organization. So this is seems like the second volume of that story. Right? It has to do much with ethnic identity. Right? It goes through cycles of history. In the 20th century, historians have categorized the ethnic Mexican experience, just like the ethnic Italian experience, or the ethnic Irish experience, or the ethnic German experience. People from Europe are ethnics also, right? With every generation, their identity changes, right? And one big one is language, right? The farther that a generation moves away from their immigrant origins, the language facility of their parents or grandparents, unless they make a real effort at it, right? Unless they make a real effort at it, it diminishes, right? And that's a huge part of one's identity is language, right? Whether it is German or whether it's Italian, for example, whether it's a Scandinavian language, or Hispanic, Latino language, right, and Spanish. If you move away from that language, your identity changes too, right? And I track that. So early in the 20th century, as we had these waves of immigrants, I call them migrants because California used to be part of Mexico, right? And I mean that's why we have places called San Francisco, Los Angeles, Santa Barbara, right? San Jose, right? These are just explicit examples that Mexicans have been here prior to European immigrants, right? So I'm shifting away from using the word immigrants to describe ethnic Mexicans because they've been here so long, and we've had different waves over time of ethnic Mexicans, right? And many of them can be immigrants. Many of them are the sons and daughters of immigrants, and others are the grandchildren or great-grandchildren of immigrants, right? And so that's what I look at in terms of ethnic identity by way of a story, and the issue of their generation. The early 20th century is largely known as, historians categorize them. And these are not neat categories, but they're categories in which make us understand what we're looking at. The Mexicanist generation. This was the generation that, even if they were U.S. citizens and grandchildren of Mexican immigrants, right? Or maybe in Los Angeles before the Mexican-American War of 1846, 1848, right? They were here also too, smaller numbers. Even then, they identified with being Mexican, right? If you asked them, what are you? So, I'm a Mexican, right? And larger society let them know that too, right? And it was often in a derogatory manner, in a pejorative manner. Oftentimes the word Mexican was a slur, right? Just the connotation in which it was used was a slur. I like watching movies, and one movie that really highlights that is to watch the movie, I think it was Edna Thurber's novel, turned into a movie, Giant. Giant, right? If you watch Giant, hey, where are my Mexicans, right? Get the Mexicans, right? And it's they're subordinated. It's clear in that movie. That movie's in the category of A Raisin in the Sun with Sidney Poitier, in terms of exposing the white supremacist, racist ideology that was predominant. I mean, it's like reading Huckleberry Finn, right? You read Huckleberry Finn, you get a good sense of how life and society was in 19th century America, in Missouri, and also going into the South, right? Those two movies encapsulate that, right? But it was brought into a large national audience. Right? That's the historical significance of movies such as those, and also labor. I was just talking to Victor earlier into one of my favorite movies to watch, On the Waterfront, right?
Yes.
Right, you get a sense in terms of the shape-up system, right, in which people had to compete against each other, and how the younger were always favored, and the older ones were left out of work without any work and not any support whatsoever. So I look at the generations. Then after the Mexicanist generation, there was much like what's happening today, the deportation campaigns were taking place during the 1930s. And repatriation campaigns. Many of them, just like the Americans of Japanese ancestry, U.S. citizens were being incarcerated in World War II. Many of the people that were being deported to Mexico had never been to Mexico. The large part of them were the sons and daughters of immigrants, right? And that cut off a stream of rejuvenation, if you will, of people to build upon their Mexican identity. It cut off that stream. And as a result of that, those that remained here in the United States developed more of a Mexican-American identity, right? Because immigrants have a way of rejuvenating ethnicity by way of stores and music and language and in the school. So even though, for example, myself, I was born here in the United States. My mother's from Mexico, Chihuahua. My dad was born in Rancho Césped by Fillmore. Spanish was a predominant language, but as my mother became more fluent in English, English became the predominant language of the household. But at school, I had a lot of friends that were immigrants, and they showed me to speak Spanish, oftentimes, the not so nice words, right? Right? I learned, I got a sensitivity in terms of the nuances of language, right, from there, and the meanings and the connotation of language. So after the Great Depression, you have this World War II, in World War II, you have the Mexican-American generation. And between 1946 and the 1960s and 70s, you have the offspring of the Mexican-American generation. Right? And they're known as the Chicano generation. That's the generation of historians. It's not so neatly characterized, right? There's a lot of overlap. Many Chicano youth were Mexican immigrants themselves, right? They were Mexican immigrants themselves, but they were largely raised in the United States. They may have come in their, in their early childhood, or they may have come in their early adolescence, right? So they had these, these issues of identity are not so clean, right? It's situational. It has to do with circumstance. And same thing for the elders too. And that's part of what I'm trying to discuss is to get to the chase. And is that it was the Mexican American generation and also Mexicanists, people who saw themselves as Mexican. They identified with the struggle of the youth, right? And they began to feel a responsibility to protect the youth, right? And stand up for the youth as they saw them putting themselves at risk in terms of being activists, challenging racism in school and being punished for that, right? And there's a classic, and one of the reasons why I took this on was a documentary that came out in the 1990s. It's on the internet if you look for it. It's called Chicana, the history of the Mexican American experience, or something to that. So you just punch in Chicano, history of Mexican Americans, and it deals with one of the episodes, like 5 different episodes, and one of the episodes deals with the blowouts in East Los Angeles. The schools, Mexican American youth left the schools in protest to affect the average daily attendance. So schools would lose money. They would lose money as a result of the protest, a protest to tracking, a protest to segregation within schools, unequal funding of schools within the district, right? You would have college prep classes in one school, right, and no college prep classes in another school, right? Yeah. Enrichment programs in one school, enrichment programs, music, for example, band, dance, not existent in another school. Those were the sorts of issues that were being protested against. And also to blatant experiences of racism, right? So a large part of the story in the literature is that students walked out and protested, but it was with the help and guidance of people such as Sal Castro, right, who was a young 30-year-old counselor / teacher. And he mentored the youth and organized them in terms of, okay, you have to, in other words, you have to get your act together first before you go out and protest, right? You also have to know what the consequences will be if you're going to go out and protest, right? And he was right with them in their struggle, right? So I said, wow, that's powerful, right? And there's another aspect of that. I think it's the same episode where it's the Chicano 10 or Chicano 13, I'm forgetting, where they get charged with conspiracy, right? To protest, to organize a protest, right? That was a felony. The protest itself was a misdemeanor, but as though it was a conspiracy charges, it got into a felony. And then they're walking out of the schools, and the children are being brutalized by the Los Angeles Police Department. That will happen too. That will happen too. The Los Angeles Police Department, they have a school board meeting, and the parents start to step up to the podium. And the generation before, the youth step up to the podium. And there's one woman, if you remember, that approaches the podium. She's almost crying. And she's pleading with herself and pleading with the audience. We just can't let our children get slaughtered out in the streets, right? It's pretty moving. So I saw echoes of that in my research here in Ventura County. So that's part of what I do here in my work. And one early example, this is the community service organization in Oxnard. It was on Hay Street at first, just across the street from the packing house in La Colonia. And its origins came from the Oxnard Civic Improvement, I think it was Club Association, Oxnard Civic Improvement Association, that protested police brutality. They had stormed a church bazaar that was taking place, some kind of incident had taken place, and they came in, and there's always a propensity to overreact on the part of the Oxnard Police Department. So they're called in to break up a fight, right? But in the process of breaking up the fight, it explodes to a larger incident, right? And as a result of that, one of the major community organizers of the time was Tony Del Buono. And that's Tony Del Buono. He's from Texas. He's a Texas migrant. He was active. He had a nursery in Camarillo. He had a nursery, and he was highly involved in the community. Oxnard, like today, was the largest municipality in Ventura County at the time. And he will, along with a young Cesar Chavez there.
That is?
That's him. He's about 30 years old, 29 years old there. 31, because he was born in 27, that's 1958. And they organized the community service organization, and one of the main purposes, because they worked with the Packing House Union, the United Cannery and Packing House Union of America, it was from Chicago. We also support packing house workers here in the citrus industry. So they had campaigns, and it was a scaffolded campaign. Right? It was scaffolded in terms of immigration support services. Then from there was citizenship courses, right? So those long-time immigrants they tried to get them to become U.S. citizens, and there was always this tension between, because we all have our loyalties, right, to the countries that we're born, right? If we were going to another country, not many of us would, quickly, adopt another citizenship, right? So there was always that tension of becoming citizens. So they would try to get them to become naturalized, and once they were naturalized, they tried to get them registered to vote, right? Once they were registered to vote, now the idea was to get them to the voting, polls when it was happening. So that was what I mean. It was scaffolded. That was one of the major goals, or major aspect of the mission. In addition to continuously fight police brutality, that was always a major issue. And Cesar Chavez was committed to that, in addition to others. So Tony Del Buono worked, and the CSO had youth program, had family program. So it was not just an organization for adults, right? It was an organization in which the whole families were integrated. And that's part of what I try to demonstrate, is that the youth saw the example of their parents. They saw the example of their parents in terms of organizing, being civically engaged, saw the example of their parents advocating for people in their community that were vulnerable, right? Particularly the undocumented immigrant, right? Or who were exploited by the growers, right? In terms of not giving just wages, not paying for overtime, not having bathrooms, that was a big one, not having anywhere to have sanitation, for example. And the youth saw this. And so it didn't just, the idea of activism, youth activism, did not just appear out of nowhere. There was a long tradition of activism and organization and civic participation. And in regards to my role as a historian and a person that teaches Chicano history, we fight stereotypes. one of the major stereotypes of the Mexican community is that they're apathetic, right? And one of the major stereotypes is that they're not politically involved, right? That they're not interested in local politics, right? And if we look at the history carefully, you see that's a myth, right? And one thing about myth, and I may have mentioned last time I was here, was that what makes myth powerful is that there are elements of truth to it, and there are lies to it, right? And the myth is powerful because it's hard to distinguish what the truth and what the lie is. So that's Cesar Chavez there, 1958, and one of the major figures of the CSO was Juan John Soria. He was a graduate of Oxnard High School. He was a football player, went on to get a scholarship to school in Texas, then got hurt, but he came back. But he comes from that tradition, that family tradition. His mother was part of the 1941 citrus strike in Ventura County. It was a county-wide citrus strike. She was a leader in that strike, and then his family were local entrepreneurs, restaurant owners in Oxnard, right? And he was the first-hand assistant of Cesar Chavez, right, in developing the CSO, and he worked closely with youth also. When the Brown Berets here in Oxnard were following up on the Chicana moratorium, protesting U.S. foreign policy in Vietnam and trying to stop the Vietnam War because there was a disproportionate casualty rate amongst Mexican Americans with larger populations, right? And for example, in the Southwest region, the Mexican American population made up, for the sake of, I don't know the exact numbers, but let's use this for an example. They made up 11% of the population in the Southwest, but they were 18 to 20% of the casualty rates. The casualty rate was disproportionate. Right? And that was a major issue with the protest. So as the Chicano moratorium was turned violent on the part of the Los Angeles Police Department and the Los Angeles County Sheriff, they stormed a peaceful protest that involved family members, right, children and elderly, and they killed a major voice amongst three. They killed a major voice with Ruben Salazar, who was a former Los Angeles Times columnist, newspaper journalist. He was killed by a county sheriff with a tear gas canister that could penetrate concrete. They shot it into a bar, and he was in the bar decompressing from the events of the riot on the part of law enforcement. They instigated it. So about a month later, there was a follow-up protest in Oxnard, and the Brown Berets and other community members came together to make sure that, and they were working with the Oxnard Police Department. They were working with the Oxnard to make sure that there wouldn't be a repeat of Los Angeles, East Los Angeles. And one of the supporters of this organization and the Brown Berets was Juan Soria. So another example of the non-baby boom generation being there side by side, if not up front with the youth. And he developed a lot of organizations. One was the Mexican American Political Association. So where the CSO was more civically organized and service-oriented for the community, the Mexican American Political Association was more electorally oriented in terms of registering voters and getting out the vote, and it was more democratically inclined, right? And Juan Soria established a local chapter because it was a national organization, largely California, but also parts of the Southwest. So that's him, and one of the first vice presidents was a Brown Beret, right? Still alive here in Ventura County. So you see and read the newspaper, they list the officers, right? You're seeing certain names reappear over and over again, and you're seeing certain names in regards to their age group, where they belong, right? So it's not just 18 to 22-year-olds pushing the Chicana movement, right? It's people like Juan Soria, who was about 30 years old at this time. He was a big person, it's about 6'3",
6'5".
6'5"?
Yeah.
6'5", and over 250 pounds, and he utilized that in terms of his civic activism, right? He knew he was very present. He was very aware of his physicality, right? And by the way, I'll take questions before it's over, so if you have a question, just hold on to it. And this is Rachel Murguia Wang. She married a person from China. She went to UCLA and fell in love and married a person from China. They lived in China, Hong Kong for 1 year, and they returned to California. She's originally from Rancho Cespe, then moved briefly to Port Hueneme, then went on to Monterey. Lived in Monterey, then after her marriage, 1 year in Hong Kong, resettled in North Oxnard. Right? And she was married to an engineer. And she was highly involved in different civic committees at the city level, and also in regards to the Ventura College, Community College District. She was involved there. She's just everywhere, right? And, she ran for the Oxnard School Board, and eventually she won. She wanted to become a Brown Beret. She was fascinated by the community work, but they suggested that she would be better serve the community in other areas. And I think it may have been because of her age, because the Brown Berets did have women members, right? Yeah, they did have women members, but they were younger women, where she was already entering her 30s at this time. And she had a family, she was middle class. She lived in North Oxnard, which was, the moving on up part of Oxnard at the time, right? And she lived there. So I think these different aspects of her biography kind of they discourage people not being members. So that's on the left. That's with her husband. I forgot her husband's name. And on the right, that's her portrait for when she was elected to the Oxnard School District. And she was a major proponent, advocate for the desegregation of schools. She was the insider. She was the insider in the school district when there was pressure on the outside to desegregate schools. And also at the beginning, it was not to desegregate schools, it was just to have equitable schools, right? Because there's an inconvenience with being bused, right? So there were people in La Colonia that didn't want busing. A large number of them didn't want busing, right? And just like there was a large number in North Oxnard that did not want busing, right? They loved their neighborhood schools. It was convenient for the children to just walk on over and go to their school. So the issue initially was equitable schools, right? But as there was resistance to equitable schools, and even just recognizing that there was segregation, it became polarized. And then as well, if busing is the only solution, then that's what we have to do, right? And then initially, there would be a court case led by the nieces, Juan Soria, and led by his brother. That they were the lead plaintiffs, but there were also African American children that were plaintiffs in that case. And that's another story that has to be told, right? It's like the Mendez versus Westminster case in Orange County. The Mendez family was the lead plaintiffs, but what's coming out now is that the non-lead plaintiffs are beginning to tell their story, right? That is not necessarily in line with the family of Sylvia Mendez. this, right? So history is always being reconsidered, revised, right? All history is revised. That has usually a negative connotation, all revisionist history. Well, all knowledge is revisionist, right? It's just like, science is revisionist, right? We don't go off the science that existed 50 years ago. We don't go to our doctors to base their treatment of an illness based on 50 years of knowledge that took place earlier, right? We want the latest, right, information to treat. Same thing with history. It's always being under reconsideration. So maybe in 10 years you'll have another group. Now it wasn't just Mexican Americans too. African Americans were mentoring Mexican Americans, right? And one is Bert Hammond. He was a school teacher that was recruited to teach in the Oxnard Union High School District. He was a track star. He was a veteran, an Army veteran officer. And he taught business and other courses. He was a coach at Oxnard High School. And he coached track and other sports, and he also coached cross country. And on the right, you see they were Chicano runners, right? And they won. He was also involved in the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. He was also like Tony Del Buono and Juan Soria and Rachel Murguia Wong. He was involved in the politics of the day. He was involved in the desegregation of schools conversation. He was involved in regards to what we call white trade only businesses, right? And there would be signs, just like in Texas and other parts of the South, white trade only, right? He would be involved in challenging that. And again, he served as an example, being civically involved, being involved in the politics, and his students, his athletes saw that, right? And I know this because I interviewed some of them, right? And some of them would move on to being Brown Berets, other ones would be activists in the 60s, in addition to what traditions existed in their families, right? So they won the CIF championship, first to win a CIF championship in Ventura County, if not Oxnard High School. And the school just simply said, okay, fine, good job. No, they wanted recognition. Just as a football team would be recognized, or a basketball team would be recognized for winning such a prestigious championship, right? And they protested, and their coach also advocated for them, and they had their ceremony, right? They had their triumph for this. And so Bert Hammond was another individual, and here's just so you know that there's John Flynn. John Flynn was a member of the NAACP back then. He was also involved in the farm workers movement in Ventura County. His name pops up also too, part of the Friends of the Farm Workers during the 60s and 70s. And another person that you can't really see him, but in terms of schooling, he was an advocate on part for people. His name is William Bill Terry. William Bill Terry is still with us. He runs a community garden off of Gonzales Road. I think it's a Methodist church off of Gonzales Road, right before Oxnard High School, the new Oxnard High School there. Yeah. So one of my local heroes. Right? Him and his wife, and not as much anymore, but they always sat in the front row of every Oxnard City Council meeting. When I first came into town, they were there. They don't do that as much in various reasons, but he had a social cultural group called Uhuru, and he was also part of a commission, a civic commission in Oxnard, and also Ventura County, and he was supporting students.
Be a teacher?
No, he worked in the grocery industry. And he was a union member of the grocery. And that's part of the background of many of these mentors. They were involved in unions in one manner or another. So they had that collectivist mentality, right? They had that union advocacy mentality, that activism of unionism behind them. That's William Terry. And then another person who's still with us is Bobby Borrego. He's son of Paula. He would eventually be self-teach himself. He didn't get the education that he felt he should have gotten in Santa Paula, so he went back to Ventura College, took business classes, really studied to improve his reading and his writing. He would become the assistant to John Flynn as supervisor in the 1970s. And he was actively involved in the farm workers movement in Ventura County, created an organization with others, Friends of the Farm Workers, right? And his daughter, one of the examples, his daughter would pick up on that. She was here in our last talk, Diana Borrego Martinez. She was here sitting down, and here she spoke in my classes up until recently. And there she is getting arrested. And look, if you see this, this is from an LA Times photograph. She's gleaming. She's smiling as though this is like a rite of passage for her. You know, she's being baptized right into the movement, right? And we asked her in the class. A student asked her, "What did your parents think about you getting arrested?" He said, "Oh, that was great." Yeah, right? Because that already existed with her mother and father. Right, and that's a pretty bold move. They have Wanda Picker statue at the Citrus Festival in Santa Paula. I mean, this is to be honoring the United Farm Workers in Santa Paula in the 1960s. Yeah. You know, that was not normal. Let's put it that way. Maybe it is more acceptable now, but back then it was a highly charged issue. And they would take out an article. This is two images to paste together. They took out an ad in the Ventura County Star Free Press. It was Ventura County Star Free Press back then. And they took out an article that says, "In support of Cesar Chavez." Right? And what I like about this article, they start off sentence number one. It says, "We are Mexican Americans, non-farm workers." Right? They're separating themselves from being Mexican immigrants. Right? They're separating themselves from being agricultural workers, even though they're probably agricultural workers at one time in their life, right? So they go on to list their support for Cesar Chavez, right? And they have about 200 signatories on this ad that they took out. Right? I thought that was that was a treasure of a find when I went to visit the Ruther Library in Detroit this past April, right? And so that's one of the things that gets historians really happy when they find something like, whoa, this is so revealing. So I was able to write down the date and go back and order the reel for the Ventura County Star Free Press. And another example of a mentor of the Chicana movement was Ray Reyes. He was a counselor and teacher at Ventura College. And he's like the Sal Castro of Ventura County. Right? And he was born and raised in Los Angeles. And he was brought in because students and the community began to demand a faculty and staff in schools that reflected them, right? Faculty and staff and administration that understood the needs, right? And also the strengths of their community. Right? And as a result of these protests, these demands, this was happening in Moore Park College too. Right? we have people being brought on like Ray Reyes, right? That really supported students, trained students to organize, trained students. And one of the big things for Ray Reyes was having students involved in student government and making sure that they knew Robert's Rules of Order, right? So, and also to run for student government to control budgets in which they were administering funds for, right? And they took care of students. You know, they came to the aid of students when they got in trouble, right? We all as youth sometimes don't do things the right way, right? And guided them through protocols of the administration, how to approach the president and so forth. So one of my friends in the community was a student of his, and he would say to them when they had the organization of Mecha, el Movimiento Estudiantil Chicano de Aztlán, he said, Mecha is not a club, it's an organization. We're here to do something. We're not here just to have celebrations and be a social group, right? We're here to be political, right? And from that, they established a radio show. They had a student newspaper. They ran for student government, and they protested. Yeah. So there he is protesting and setting the example. And there he is. You can see he had a certain demeanor to him. Right? He had a certain demeanor, a certain savoir-faire, if you will. Savoir-faire, I was telling my students today, savoir-faire is, in today's term, is called swag. Right? He had a certain swag to him, right? But he and others knew that had to be example. Swag had to be example because because their community was vulnerable, they didn't have power, they had to approach power with almost a hat in hand, right? And that was a time period where that was no longer acceptable, right? That we were going to approach power on equal terms, right? So, but first you have to example of that. So that's and update. I'll take questions. Update was this past Thursday. I had a meeting with the former president at Cal State University, Northridge, kindergarten campus. She was doing some consulting and she was asking me questions. And towards the end, she asked me if I knew so-and-so at the Chicano Studies Department at CISA. Right? And I said, oh yes, I know Professor so-and-so, I know Professor so-and-so. Actually, they're mentors of mine, you know, particularly a professor who lives in Simi Valley. He's my mentor. And then she said, you know what, Frank? The Chicano Studies Department at CISA, they took care of their students. You know, when they were in trouble or they needed a house, they took them into their house. And they made sure that they were going to solve their problems, right? And I went to the Chicano Studies Department years when I first returned to Ventura County. I went to visit them at Northridge. They have a center there. It's the Chicano Studies Center. And not only that, they have a pantry, a food pantry, in which they knew that some students were, it's called food insecure. They did not have food, so the professors provided them food. And they're ahead of the game because that's what many universities are doing now. Because many of our students, I read a statistic, up to 40% of our students in the CSU are food insecure. Right? They don't know where they're going to get their next meal. And then there's another number in terms of many of them being homeless. Right? They live in their cars. They live in libraries. They exercise their hygiene in the gyms and locker rooms, right? The Chicano Studies Department was ahead of the game in terms of that. And another thing she said that when she spoke with Chicano Studies students from CSUN, you know, she recognized how they had been prepped, right? They had an agenda. They were systematic, and that didn't come out of nowhere, right? It came out of a training. It came out of a schooling. So that's my latest update as of Thursday of this week. So, thank you for your attendance. I'll take questions. Victor.
Yes, was one of the Saros who was supposed to be a good track? I have several questions, by the way.
Okay.
And I guess I don't mean to apologize, but not being from Ventura, Oxnard, and being from the big city of Oakland, seeing all that stuff going on here, I was really shocked that Ventura, Oxnard was so active in some of these things. But was any of the Saros in that picture of the CIM track?
Yes, I want to say yes.
Okay, and what is these, Suavia restaurant and Ventura part of that Soria family?
I've never heard that.
Okay.
Their restaurant was Cafe Fortuna.
Oh, okay. And what about Corky and Tejerina? Did they ever come here?
They actually came to Ventura College to speak at colleges, Moore Park College and also
Okay.
Ventura College. And they were invited by students more than once.
Corky was instrumental in me getting a job working for Tom Lauterbach, the former raider that owned Coors distributorship in Oakland. They needed to hire a black and a Mexican, and the owner to Mexicali Rose was the moving force for me to get that job. And do you know if anyone in Oxnard belonged to Venceremos?
I don't know.
Okay, or go to Cuba during the late 60s, the cut sugar came?
I never heard of
Okay.
it.
And does CI have a Chicano center?
They don't have a center.
Okay.
They just has a Chicano Studies program,
Yes.
a bachelor's degree program. But we're working on that.
Okay. I'd like to contribute to that.
Okay. Thank you. Beverly, okay, go, Margo, go ahead.
I've known the Hammond family my whole life, and I interviewed his daughter. I'll send you her information. But she mentioned that when they came to Oxnard in 1958 from upstate New York, and that Burt Hammond was given a cross-country team as a means of marginalizing him and his abilities.
Wow.
And that the Chicano, you know, if you look at the yearbooks from that era, you will see the cross-country team is exclusively Chicano, and that the Chicano students were encouraged to go into cross-country, largely because the cross-country sport was not NCAA rated for that division at that time. So if those excellent athletes had been competing in, say, track and field, their abilities would have given them access to higher education that they did not have because they were on the cross-country team. So not only were they not celebrated at the school, they were also not given what they should have been given for their amazing abilities under Coach Hammond. But my question was really, it's so great that you're bringing out the mentorship. And I remember from your first book, you outlined how in the press, in the 40s, how the Pachuco, you know, anybody who was a young Mexican was labeled a Pachuco, and how the press kind of systematically painted this portrait of Mexican youth as dangerous, volatile. And I also know from that era that the press didn't mention the mentorship that was going on, and they focused exclusively on the youth, painting it as a movement that was kind of just in the hands of these kids. What was the consequence of that image? That was
Well, there was a lot of police harassment in that regard, harass. But there would be also certain organizations in Oxnard led by ethnic Mexicans, adults, to give them spaces where they could recreate, where they could have dances without having to fear police swarming in, and also making sure that you know, they remain peaceful dances, right? Because there's always that happens at dances sometimes, these rivalries that emerge. Yes, and it would continue later on. For example, the CSO would have dances. They would have, for a couple years, they had quinceañeras because many families couldn't afford a quinceañera, so they would have a quinceañera, you know, coming out celebration for young girls, young women, and that was the way in which they would celebrate, sponsored certain events. Yes, sir.
I used to teach class in politics and cinema, so I love your references to movies, but One of the movies I showed was Mi Familia, which is my family. And I thought that did a really good job of portraying the period that you were talking about
Mhm.
too.
It goes through different eras of the Mexican American experience, right?
Exactly, and all the different generations.
Where one thing that comes to mind is you mentioned that as well, how the old California was buried in the backyard.
Yes.
Right? So, yes.
I was wondering if you might offer an understanding as to why mentors or elders during that period were kind of pushed to the side in the historical narrative. Was it historians who kind of left them out of the picture? Was it the youth who kind of took on this this framing that they were the leaders? Like, what explains why mentors have been kind of set to the side?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yes, they're not emphasized definitely oftentimes, right? But they're there. And I can only say because maybe the youth movements are a little bit more dramatic.
Yeah. And the press covers them better.
Yes, and so that's something that we want to sell newspapers, right? And but that's a great question, and but I would say if people pay close attention, and historians maybe pay closer attention, there were the elders or the non-youth activists, they were pretty militant themselves. I mean, one of the chapters in the book that was an impetus for this project, it was actually an article, and it's called Measured Militancy, right? It was a militancy, but it wasn't as youthful, but they took to the streets too. I mean, the NAACP here in Ventura County did a protest march against segregation. They would jam city council meetings and Oxnard School District meetings. And similarly with the CSO, the community and Cesar Chavez. And the idea of jamming meetings, right? Almost taking over meetings, taking over agendas was part of their toolkit, right? That they had with them. At the same time, they had these back channels conversations with city officials and district officials. It was a complement of strategies that was utilized. But usually the newspaper doesn't cover the back channel work, right? It is the contentious city council meeting that they'll cover, right? But and it was the non youth advocates, activists that were checking the police chiefs. They were checking the school board and the superintendents, right? And checking them, I mean that they were letting them know they were being watched. That the youth, like what's happening in LA, that they weren't out there by themselves, right? That they were people concerned for their welfare.
Frank, to complement your subject matter here, on KCET on Wednesdays at 8 p.m., they have a series of programs or series of nights on the California early history and the 1900s up to maybe, I don't know, the 60s or the 70s. But I was interested, I made a note of it. I want to watch that, but it might be something to complement your subject.
I'll look into that. That's channel 10 here.
And channel 28 locally.
Okay. Laura, you're doing
Oh, but actually, all I wanted to say is, yes, I would say that the older Chicano mentors of the 60s and 70s did really do a very good job of interfacing with government officials, with courts, with the police departments, with the sheriff departments, and I'm speaking more of the Northern California movements, that they were very, very active and in the face of city governments, of local county governments, to get Chicanos employed, represented, to recognize the police brutality, to counter all these things, but they did it also in a way that was powerful, impactful, and did work with the system too, but also started integrating Chicano leaders to run for office.
Sure.
You know, whether they were successful or not, but that was the focus. So mentoring was one of the panoply of ways to get engaged, all of the things. But they also were instrumental in getting the ancianos, the older generation,
Oh, that's right.
to get rolling.
Sure.
Not only get their citizenship and get voting, but also support the youth.
Definitely.
Thank you. Comment?
And I came in late, but I just wanted to mention that I grew up in East LA, in Maravilla. In the 50s and 60s, around the 70s. My mother-in-law still lives on First and Humphreys. She's 91 years old. But I was going to East LA College in 68. And that's when MASA, Mexican American Student Association, I was a member. And then the UMAS came in, the United Mexican American, and then the Brown Berets came out of East LA College. And I was at the moratorium, and they landed at Salazar Park. But that's when I had like a riot or something. The sheriff came in and they were disbanding the whole park and everything. And so anyway, I grew up around that era, and I still have contact in East LA. I also went to Denver, Colorado when I went to see Reyes de Harina and Corky Gonzalez, and people that started the MAOF, Daniso Morales, and those guys. And I'm one of the veterans, I was born in 41, I went to Garfield High School, class of 59. And next Sunday, I'm going to go to our 60th reunion.
Oh, boy.
So, went to Belvedere Junior High for that, all of that area. But,
He's a pre-boomer.
and now, it's interesting, but it's good that they're bringing up the history before. You know, my uncles were in the war. And they dressed like zoot suiters, and they had, that's when the Navy guys downtown attacked the Mexicans, for whatever reason. But I was there, so I've been there, and I really appreciate the doctor here for bringing it out. Because it's nice, it's good. Sometimes you don't want to talk about the past, but it's good to know about the past. So that's why I'm still active. I'm part of ULAC and I'm the deputy director for California for the seniors. So my hat, it says, don't mess with the seniors. Okay? So anyway, I was expecting more people, more of the younger people, but everybody's at the soccer games.
Oh, you have a question?
Thank you. I have 3 questions. The first question is, do you have any of your books that are being sold here?
Not here with me, I should have.
Oh.
I'm really bad at that. I'm asking Margot for advice.
Well, I bought her book already.
Margot's speaking at the Cameron Library tomorrow at 3 o'clock?
2, at 2 o'clock, you can
And you're coming back at
And there's another presentation about segregation in La Colonia today at the All-Star Public Library at 3, which I'm
At
gonna
3
go
o'clock.
to.
Oh, good, yes. David Garcia is going to speak on his book, Strategies of Segregation,
3.
at 3 o'clock, right? The Oxnard Public Library. Yeah, that's 2?
That's 2. And also, where can I get brown berets? And another one is there any type of community organizations where, I'm not in college anymore, I graduated from Cal State Channel Islands before there was even like a Chicana studies program, which I'm really bummed about. It was great, but it was 2007 when it was barely,
Yeah,
starting up,
yeah.
but I'm jealous that there's
Yeah.
all this knowledge now and
It's the baby
this
boom.
community importance that's being brought up, because when I attended there, it was I was the only like brown person there, but I was wondering if there is anything that maybe like, I know you said it's not a club, like Medchas, like an organization where in the community or anywhere that we can meet, just talk about things like that.
Yeah, he'll sign you up for LULAC right here, the League of United Latin American Citizens is one. I'm a member. I forgot your name.
Pete,
Pete.
Placencia.
Pete Placencia, thank you for receiving. He'll sign you up, he's an officer, or was an officer, right? Now you're not an officer, but I can send you, contact me, I can send you our next meeting date.
There's also AME. We have a chapter in Oxford.
Okay. We meet the first Saturday of the month. That's our clinica on Saticoy, on the second floor.
It's because I work with the city of Oxnard for recreation services, so we serve about 2,200 kids a day in the after-school program with the Oxnard Scholars. So it would be nice to have some of our employees who are mostly college students to get involved into knowing why it's so important to work with these kids. I mean, I'm a little older now, but it's still important to be kind of, you know, and I recognize Pete from coming in and saying hi to us at the recreation department, but it's a big impact that a lot of them don't understand how important it is for them to be there.
Definitely. Excellent. Matter of fact, I'm reminded of the Association of Mexican American Educators. One of the early founders of that organization was Gil Cuevas, who was a counselor at Hueneme High School, Oxnard High School, and he was also mentoring youth, and he was the founder of Future Leaders of America in regards to getting students into high school students into colleges, and would be successful in getting them to Stanford, Yale, Harvard, many of them coming back and being local officials in Port Hueneme too. Right? So that's another group. Amen. So I want to thank you, everybody.
I think you have more questions.
Okay, all right. Yes.
In 1952, a friend played a record for me, and the record was played by Rafael Mendez, who then did a lot of background music for Hollywood movies, and he was in some movies himself, which are online. At that time, I was told he was the greatest trumpet player in the world. And when I heard that record, I said, I gotta play the trumpet. So I learned quickly, and within a year, my grade school teacher sent me to a professor of music who played with the New York Symphony. And I mentioned that record to him, and he said, Benny, when you play like Rafael Mendez, you will be a trumpet player. Are you familiar with Rafael Mendez?
I am not. I'm going to look
He's
him up.
online. All this stuff is online, including some instructions related to how to do it.
Cool.
Yeah.
Thank you.
It's oriented toward young people, and what I got out of his instruction was practice, practice, and he does that. Practice, practice, practice. On the other side of the coin, I'm not trying to be funny. It's the way I'm politically oriented. I still am, but I watch my step. My two favorite Chicano Mexican politicians were Pancho Villa and Emilio Zapata. I'm of that frame of mind. They got things done.
Yes.
But I have two T-shirts that I bought over at the flea market right here at the college, in the college. And my Chicano buddies appreciate it. And I wear them to the Spanish Mass that I go to every Sunday. Sometimes, I don't overdo it. So I'm a full supporter of Chicano culture.
Thank you.
Okay, I think you have one more.
Frank, and we all know that a lot of battleships were named after famous families, but there's a fellow in Ojai. We met him and his wife somewhere. They invited us to go to a veterans thing one November several years ago, but to come to find out, his family has a ship, U.S. naval ship named after his family because of his brothers. They were in World War II.
Okay, I'm not aware of that.
Well, thank you very much for coming.
I appreciate it.
And I'm sure that Larry wants to have you.
Okay, I will. I love coming here. This is really a great program. You go on their website, they have a long list of speakers, and in October, my former colleague, she's retired, Joan Peters, in October, is going to be speaking on the Me Too movement, then and now.
Yeah. It's October, I don't, it's on the schedule.
So-
No,
So I encourage you to
you'll
attend
hand out
that.
some calendars for us, okay?
Thank you.
We're going to be passing the
October 12th.
hat because we don't have regular support from the city. So we just pass the hat, everybody can put whatever you wish in. There's no fee to come in, so.
You like that?
Yeah.